Hello and welcome to Jason's Macintosh Museum. I'm Jason, your host, and today we're looking at a Macintosh LC 630 from 1994. The LC 630 was the last LC desktop model produced in a long line of LC systems that went back all the way to the original LC of 1990. Now, the whole premise behind the LC series was, well, the letters LC meaning low cost or low cost colour. It was really a way for Apple to offer a price competitive system, mainly for the educational market. And the LC 630 is no exception. It was actually based on the identical looking Quadra 630 that came out in March of 1994. But the only difference between the Quadra 630 and the LC 630 was the CPU. Both machines had a Motorola 68040 CPU running at 33 MHz, but the Quadra got the full 040 chip with a built-in floating point unit. The LC received the 68LC040, which did not have a floating point unit. But in normal use, that probably wasn't a big deal. What was a big deal, though, was other changes that Apple made in terms of cutting costs for both the Quadra and the LC 630. Primarily in the area of storage, because the Quadra and LC 630s have the rather dubious honour of being the very first models of Macintosh to use an IDE hard disk rather than a SCSI hard disk. Because anyone who knows old Macs knows that ever since the Macintosh Plus, or in fact, well, Macintosh SE, back in the mid-80s, Apple have always used SCSI hard disks. And that's a tradition that carried right up until the mid to late 1990s. But in the mid-1990s, Apple, looking to cut costs, started using more, shall we say, IBM-compatible components and standards in their machines. And one of those was the IDE hard disk. And so the LC 630 was the first to get that. Now, that certainly did improve or reduce the cost of the machine, but it had a definite impact on performance because the IDE subsystem used in the Quadra and LC 630 could not operate in the so-called DMA transfer mode. It had to use the slower PIO or programmed I/O data transfer mode. And anyone who's worked with old IDE hard disks knows that if you run a hard disk in PIO mode, the performance is far worse than you would get if you're running it in DMA or Ultra DMA mode. But these machines, you had to run them in PIO mode, you had no choice. Now, of course, even though the performance did suffer, what using IDE allowed Apple to do was to offer a much larger hard disk that would normally be fitted to a system like this. In fact, with the LC 630, you got a 250 megabyte hard disk as standard, with an optional 500 megabyte hard disk, which for the time was quite impressive. Now, in the other area where they cut costs on the LC and Quadra 630 was to do with the SCSI bus itself. Because even though the hard disk in these machines was IDE, the CD-ROM was still SCSI. And Apple thankfully still provided an external SCSI port on these machines so you could use your SCSI, your external SCSI peripherals. However, the logic at Apple was that because the hard disk is now IDE, SCSI will not be as important, and therefore we don't have to fit a high-end SCSI controller to these models, and it turns out they didn't. They fitted an old SCSI controller that was used on a lot of the 030 based machines, which compared to the ones fitted to other 040 based machines was quite a bit slower. So what that meant was if you were using external SCSI devices with an LC or Quadra 630, you wouldn't get the same SCSI performance that you would normally get. So it's just another way of keeping the cost down. But there were a lot of good points to the Quadra and LC 630 machines. First of all, the case. As you can see, it's a very slim desktop style case, a slightly larger version of the pizza box case that the older LCs used. And one thing that Apple did was they made it very easy to access the motherboard and the hard disk and CD-ROM drives, because in fact, as we'll see in a moment, the motherboard simply slides out of the back of the case without having to disconnect any plugs or any connectors. And the CD-ROM and hard disk are both mounted, and the floppy drive are all mounted in the front, and when you take the front panel off, you can easily slide them out as well. So it was a very easy machine to upgrade. Although the downside of that is if you wanted to take the entire machine apart, as we're going to do, it makes it a lot more difficult. Once you get all of the major components out, disassembling the chassis is quite an ordeal. And I should also mention that, like the Macintosh 2VX and 2VI, the Quadra LC630 used a metal chassis internally for all the components, even though the outer casing is plastic. So, some more information on the LC630. It was launched in March of 1994 and discontinued in October of 1995. It had a 33 MHz Motorola 68 LC 040 CPU. It had 4 MB of memory on board, expandable up to 68 MB, because you only had one 72-pin SIM slot to upgrade the memory with. You got a 250 or 500 MB IDE hard disk, and I think it was a double, or it could have been a quad speed CD-ROM drive. And in terms of expandability, the Quadra 630 was actually, LC630 was actually better than most, because even though there were no new bus slots or anything like that, what you did get was you got an LC processor direct slot. You also got a communication slot, which was useful for a modem or an Ethernet card, but you also got a video slot, which was used for a TV tuner or video capture card. So the expandability was quite good. And of course you also got an external SCSI port as well, albeit running on an older, slower SCSI controller. So that's our look at the Macintosh LC630. So now let's have a closer look at it. Here is the front view of the Macintosh LC630, and as you can see, it's quite a slim desktop style case. So starting from the top, we have the built-in CD-ROM here, which I believe was I think a quad speed or 4x CD-ROM, but we'll find out when we take it apart. Over from that, we've got the built-in 1.4 MB SuperDrive, but notice that this is the manual inject type of drive. In other words, the disk has to be inserted all the way into the slot before the disk will actually be loaded into the drive. And you can tell that because of the cutout at the top and the bottom of the center of the drive slot, which allows you to get your finger all the way in to push the disk forward. And across from there, we actually have an IR receiver, because with the, I believe it was with the TV tuner card that you could fit to the LC630, you had a remote control as well that you could use to turn the LC into a big television. So that was the receiver for that. Then below that we have the volume controls, the power LED, and a headphone jack. And across from there on the other side we have the Macintosh LC630 name tag. And that's about it for the front. There's not much to see on the side, so we'll flip it round and have a look at the back. Okay, here's the rear view of the Macintosh LC630, and from the top we've got the serial number and production information tag. So this unit was manufactured in March of 1995, and I believe on the serial number there, SG means it was made in Singapore, I think, but we'll probably find out later on. And then over from there we have this cutout here, or this blanking plate, which I believe is for the video card, if installed, as in the video capture or TV card. Here we have the monitor output port and power switch. Then on the other side we've got the security cable lock and power input socket. And then notice that the motherboard is contained behind this snap-in door. You can see there's a tab there and a tab over there. And in fact, you can remove the entire motherboard by simply pulling on those tabs, pulling that door down and sliding the motherboard out, which is quite nice. Now here's the blanking plate for the, this will be for the, I think that's also for the video card slot, I believe. Yes, I think it is. And down here we have all the different ports. So we've got one ADB, printer and modem ports, external SCSI, headphone jack and microphone input. And here is the blanking plate, or the slot for the LC PDS card. And as you can see, we have a looks like a 10 base 2 Ethernet card in here. Not that it does us a lot of good these days. And on the side here we have the communication slot port, which in this case is occupied by a modem. Now I believe that the LC630 has its information tag on the bottom of the case, so I'll quickly flip it up onto its end and we'll have a look at that. Yes, it turns out I was right. It seems that Apple on their later models often put the information tag on the bottom of the underside of the case. So here's the tag, so Apple Computer, model M3076, assembled in Singapore, and all the various FCC and other compliance information. Laser product, because it has a CD-ROM in it, of course. Copyright 1994, Apple Computer. So that's about all for the outside of the LC630. So now we will take it apart. Now, as I mentioned earlier on in this video, taking an LC630 apart is both very easy and very difficult, because Apple made it very easy to take the major components out of this, such as the motherboard and the drives. But if you then want to disassemble the rest of the system, it becomes very difficult very quickly. So let's start with the easy bits. First of all, the motherboard. So to do that, we have to pull up or push down on this tab here and this tab over here to release the door, the cover for the motherboard. And also be very careful when you do this, because these tabs can get very brittle over time and they can snap off if you're a little bit, if you push on them too far. So now what we have to do is remove this screw and this screw to release the motherboard, and then we can use this little handle that they've provided, which pops out like this, to pull the motherboard out. So I'll take those screws out now. Now that the screws are out, I can pull on this little handle and just carefully rocking it back and forth. The motherboard is out, just like that. So that's probably one of the easiest motherboards to remove of any machine. In fact, it's very similar to how you take a motherboard out of a Color Classic. So I'll just set that aside. Now there's nothing more you can easily remove from the back. So now we move on to the front. Now the front panel is next to come off. Now to take that off, there are two tabs. You can see one down here and one just over here. And you have to push up on those tabs while carefully lifting the bottom or swinging the bottom of the front panel out. And once you feel those tabs release, you'll then be able to lift the panel straight off the front. So you need a very thin flathead screwdriver, and you just need to push in on the tab. I'll try and do it with a shot of the camera. So if I get it in there and carefully push up on it, you can see I've just released the bottom of the panel there. If I do the same on the other side, it's very tricky to do this. There we are, and the panel has just released, just like that. So it's actually quite simple. But again, that plastic can become brittle over time, so you have to exercise extreme caution when doing that. So as you can see, we now have the front panel removed, and now we need to take out the CD-ROM and the hard disk and the floppy drive, and also this little unit here that houses the switches and LEDs. So the first thing we'll do is we'll probably take out, let's see, we'll take out the CD-ROM. And to do that, you have to push up on this little tab here and then pull the drive out, although it's quite hard to do. So I may use a screwdriver for this, just to lever it a little bit. Lever it up because you have to lever up and pull out on the drive at the same time. So in fact, a pair of pliers might be more suitable for this. Let's see if I can do this without breaking anything. Oop. Or, another way of doing it is to get your screwdriver up underneath and lever out while pushing up, like this. So if I now, there it goes. So I'm pushing up on the tab and levering out. You can see the drive is slowly starting to come out, but it's, it's putting up a fight. Mainly because it has, you have to release it from the connector at the back. There's a edge connector that the drive mates with when it's in place, and of course that can get quite stiff over time. Just be very careful not to break anything here. So this is actually harder than I thought. Very carefully lever the drive out. Now you see, that proves my point. I leave it a little bit too forcefully and snap the plastic. So there's a lesson there. But thankfully it won't affect anything because the drive can still sit in there just fine. But I shouldn't have been so forceful with that. Either way, I have to get this drive out. So you try just carefully prying on the sides just to lever it forward a tiny bit. Once that connector disengages, it should come out just fine. Here it comes. It's harder than I thought. Much harder than I thought. That's funny. Doesn't want to release any further. Well, I think what we might do, in fact, is take off the top cover at this point, because we'll have a better view of what's going on inside. So, to take off the top cover, you just slide it forward like that, because when you take the front panel off, the top cover is no longer restrained, and lift up on that. So you can see now we have the metal chassis. Now we can take off this top panel here just by removing this screw over here, up in this corner and this corner. And then we'll see if we can find out why that CD-ROM isn't coming out. So with this panel, I should be able to slide it forward like that. Oh, also the side panels, they slide forward and pop off just like that. Now, if I lift up on this, I've got to be careful because some of the cables are actually being held to the top of this cover. So I have to pull this off carefully. Oh, there it goes. So you can see that I can't pull up any further on the cover, and that's because if you look up here, see how the floppy drive cable is actually held into a clip on the top cover. So we'll just pull the floppy drive cable out and release that clip, just so I can remove the top metal cover. Right, so here's the CD-ROM, and you can see there's the edge connector, and it looks as though, it looks like it's coming out, but it's, actually no, it has released. Sorry, it has released. You can see the connector there is completely released, but the drive is still sticking. So I'll have to give it a bit of a push. Okay. Now I know why I did this in the wrong sequence. You have to remove this cover first. Look here, you can see this little metal tab that I've now slightly bent. This is what covers the hard disk, so this has to come off first. But now we've got the top cover off, we can actually take the Can we take that out too? No, we have to take this cover off first. So to do that, we'll take out this one screw here, and then everything should come out just fine. Right, so that's the that's the cover for the hard disk, and you can see how it's bent that little tab there, but I can always bend that back into place. That's no big deal. Now at this point the CD-ROM should just slide out, and it does. So there's the CD-ROM finally out of the system, and looking at it, it's a 300i, so it's a double speed CD-ROM. So we'll put that aside. Next we'll take out the floppy drive. So just lift up on that and it comes straight out. Next up is the hard disk. So to remove it, you simply, unplug the data and power cables from the front, and you can see another plastic tab just here which you have to lift up on, just like the CD-ROM, but since we have the cover off, we can easily slide out. So there's the hard disk. Right, so all the major components have now been removed from the system. That was the easy bit. Now comes the hard bit, taking everything else apart, because from this point on, Apple did not make it easy. So what we'll do now is, let's see, we'll just unplug the cable from the monitor connector board, so we'll take those out. This is the cable for the that links to the Apple video card, a TV card if you have one installed. We'll just move that out of the way. Now what we may do is remove the plastic panel from the back. So we'll undo these screws here. This one, I think these two have to come out as well, and this one, oops, can't even see it on camera. This one, this one, this one, and this one, and that should allow us to take out the plastic panel at the back. So let's see. Oh, there's the that's the cover there. Take that, put that aside. Okay, that cover is now off. Right, now let's see, the next part, we might take out the cooling fan over here, so we have to undo this screw and this screw. So I'll just take these out. And this bracket here, there's long screws there, and this bracket also lifts out. Then the fan should come out. There it goes. And notice where the fan is plugged in. It's actually connected inside the power supply, just here. So to unplug that, of course, you need to be very careful. So we'll just, I know the power supply has been discharged. It hasn't been powered on in a very long time, so I think we're okay. Just pull that out, and so now the fan is out of the system. Now, the next step, I believe, will be to take out the module at the front here that houses the buttons and LEDs, and to do that you simply pull out on it, and it should pop out like that, and you can unplug the cable from the back of it, like that. That's now out. And now the next step, I think, would be to take out this back section of the chassis that holds the fan and the monitor port. And I believe if you just lift up on it, as you can see with the screws undone, it comes out. Next step would be to take out, I think would be to take out the power supply. So to do that, we have to unplug the main connector up here. Just lift up on the harness to get access to the plug, and we have to unplug this connector over here as well. Okay, so they're out. And there is one screw to undo that you can see down in there, which holds the power supply to the inside of the case, so we have to undo that. So the power supply should now lift out of the system. Oh, there it goes. So that's the power supply removed. Now the next step would be to take out the front section of the chassis. Now I believe there are no more screws we have to undo at this point. I don't believe so. Now, again, I think I have to simply lift up on this to release it from the metal hooks. Oh, no, there is one screw. Haha, there is one hidden screw we have to undo first, and that's hidden down in here. So we have to undo that one. And now we can lift up on the entire front of the chassis and remove it. So that carries with it the edge connectors for the CD-ROM, the cables for the floppy drive, and also the main edge connector that the motherboard also connects to. So now all we have left is the speaker. Now that's secured by Velcro tabs, so you simply pull up on it and it comes straight out. All right, so that's the casing now with nothing in it. So that's how you take apart an LC630. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at some of the components. Okay, here is the logic board out of the Macintosh LC630, and you'll notice that by this time in the mid-1990s, Apple were integrating far more components on their logic boards. As you can see, there are far fewer components on here than you'd find in, say, a Mac made, say, 3 or 4 years ago. And so most of the individual ICs that we use, say, to control the video and ADB and SCSI have all been integrated into one of several large custom ICs. And we'll go through those as we have a look at the board. So starting from the top, we've got the identification up here. Apple Computer, copyright 1994. And then over from there, it looks like, not sure what that chip is. They generally don't give you an indication on these as to what the functions are. So we'll keep moving. We've got all the ports up at the top, of course, up there. And here is the single 72-pin SIM slot for system memory. So unfortunately, given that there's only one, you can expand the machine up to a total of 68 megabytes of system memory and no more. Here is the CUDA chip that controls power on, power off, and the real-time clock. And here is the 4 megabytes of onboard memory that comes as standard. And of course, here is the CPU. This is the 68. Now, technically this machine should have, being an LC, should have the 68 LC 040. This one was probably upgraded at some point, and this one actually happens to have the full 040 chip. So in a sense, this is actually the board from this would be the configuration of a Quadra 630, not an LC 630. But there it is, so the 040 running at 33 megahertz. And notice that these 040s actually did not require a heatsink. But strangely enough, if you remember, on the Quadra 950 that had the same speed and the same CPU, same clock speed, it actually did have a heatsink. So I'm not quite sure why this one doesn't, but there was no provision for it because the socket has no tabs on it that I can see that you can attach a heatsink to. So anyhow, maybe it was just a later revision of chip that didn't run quite as hot. Not sure. Anyway, moving on. Here's the first of the custom ICs. This one here. So that I'm not sure which one does what, but there are 3 custom ICs, and between them they handle memory management, glue logic, video, SCSI, ADB, I think. That could be the CUDA chip, I'm not sure about that. And pretty much everything else. So it's very well integrated. So here is the LC processor direct slot that you can put a LC PDS card into. And next to it is the communication slot used for a modem or Ethernet card. And, oh, there's a serial number of the board up there. And let's see, where to next? Let's look at the next logic chip. This one here is called Prime Time, as you can see. And this is another one of the custom chips that Apple used. And then down from that we have what I believe is the video memory. I believe there's 1 megabyte of VRAM on board, which is non-expandable. Across from there we have the next custom chip there. And it's interesting to note that all three are made by different manufacturers. This one is a, looks like a, not National Semiconductor, I can't think of the manufacturer who has that logo. I'm sure someone will tell me, but that's one. Samsung make this one, and VLSI make this one. Go figure. And over here we have the Velcro pad, which normally houses the 4.5 volt alkaline battery that these models of Macintosh have. Because by the mid-1990s, Apple had, in some systems, stopped using the old 3.6 volt lithium battery, moving to a 4.5 volt battery that looked a bit like this. I'll just put one here for to show you what they look like. This is the type of battery that they would have used. So this is in fact a 4.5 volt alkaline. Now, anyone who knows about old Macs knows that the older 3.6 volt batteries had a habit of leaking and corroding the system, the logic board. Well, these batteries unfortunately have the same problem. It's not as severe, but these can also leak and damage the board. So if you have one of these models of Mac with this battery, make sure you pull it out. They will run just fine without the battery. They simply won't hold their real-time clock or their PRAM configuration, which is really no big deal to me. But this one, for example, if you look at the connector, you can see closely that one of the pins has actually corroded. And that was caused by the battery itself. Thankfully, it didn't do any damage to the board on which the battery was placed because I got to it in time. But it's worth noting that if you have these batteries, they can fail. So there's the specs on that. So it's a 4.5 volt alkaline, as you can see. Anyway, let's move on. So what else do we have? Well, there's not much else on this board. Here's the video slot for the video capture or TV card. And then down at the bottom we have the main edge connector that was used to mate the board with the rest of the system. If you're wondering what that stuff is, that's actually contact cleaner that I'd put on some time ago, which is discoloured a bit, but still works just fine to keep the connections nice and clean. So that's really all there is to it. It's not a very complicated board. So that's the LC 630 logic board. So now we'll have a quick look at the LC PDS card and the communication slot card. Nearly forgot to mention, this board is actually double-sided, and they've stuck a few components on the reverse side of the board, mainly the ROM chips. So if you're wondering where the ROM chips were on this board, they're actually on the underside, right here. Here is the Ethernet card that was in the LC PDS slot on the LC 630. This is actually made by a company called Asante, which is apparently was a very well-known supplier of networking components for Macintosh machines. So it's a Mac LC3 Ethernet card, and the main controller looks like a National Semiconductor STNIC chip. I've got a few other chips on here, but I presume this slot here would have been for a boot ROM, possibly. And that's about it. But strangely enough, this card could have been configured with both a 10 base 2 and a 10 base T connector, which would have gone there, but this one doesn't have that. So these days it's pretty much useless. So anyhow, let's move on now to the modem card. So here is the modem card that was in the LC 630 in the communication slot, but unfortunately there are no markings on this card to tell us who made it or what the specifications are. The only thing you can see is the Australian standard tag on the chip, which I believe is a Rockwell chip. I know this one's a Rockwell, but most modems had Rockwell chipsets at this time. Having said that, it looks like it's a V34, which I believe is a 28.8 kilobit modem. And in fact, if we look at I think that's the data pump chip there, 288 DPI. So I believe it's a 28.8 modem. But apart from that, there's really not much to see. So that's the modem card. So now we'll have a quick look at the hard disk and CD-ROM. Okay, here is the hard disk out of the LC630, and I'm not entirely sure if this was the original disk that came with the machine when it was new, but having said that, the capacity is about right, and so is the data production. And I do know that Apple did use IBM IDE hard disks in a lot of their systems, so this could well be the original disk. So looking at it, it's an IBM DALA 3540, which I think means 3 platters for 540 megabytes of unformatted capacity. And you can see it was made in March of 1995. Made in Thailand for IBM Corporation. Now, sometimes on these discs, Apple will put their own logo sticker on the disc to indicate that it's an Apple OEM part, but in this case I don't see that, so not sure. It may be the original, it may not be. If we have a quick look at the back of the drive, you can see it's again very well integrated. In fact, the controller is tiny. That's the entire drive controller right there. As you can see, just a few ICs. I'm pretty sure it's probably a double-sided board, but even so, it's a very tidy design. So that's the drive. I should also mention, though, if you're trying to replace the hard disk in one of these early Macs that used IDE hard disks, you have to be careful about which one you choose, because I do believe that these old Macs can only recognize disks, I think, up to, it's either 4.3 or 8.4 gigabytes in capacity. I'm not even quite sure if it can go that high. But as well, as I mentioned before, the controller inside the LC630 can only operate the drive in PIO3 mode, programmed IO3 mode. And I believe some newer parallel ATA drives don't support PIO mode at all. Correct me if I'm wrong, but some of them, I believe, have to be run in DMA mode. By default, they don't support the older PIO transfer mode, so you may find if you use too new a drive, the capacity will be too large, and also the drive may not work at all due to the PIO mode not being supported. So a bit of trial and error there, I think, is appropriate. But certainly, if you're using an older drive like this that's less than 1 gigabyte in size, you should be fine. Here is the CD-ROM drive out of the LC630, and as I mentioned before, it's an Apple CD300i+, which means that it's a double-speed CD-ROM, manufactured February of 1995, and as you can see, it's made by, by Matsushita Electronics. And in fact, these old Matsushita drives were very, very common back in the early 90s, especially the double-speed version, and of course you can instantly recognize them by the front panel, because they all had a front panel that looked just like this. But as you can see, the Apple OEM version did not have an indicator LED, nor did it have a volume control or headphone jack, because these, of course, were placed behind the front panel of the LC, and so you couldn't access them anyway. So there was a bit of clever cost cutting there. So on the back, it's a standard SCSI CD-ROM. Now you can see we've got the edge connectors here installed, and of course, if you ever change the drive, you simply pull on these connectors to remove them, like that, and you can swap it for any other SCSI drive that you find. But with the LC, you have to put these connectors in for the drive to work, because there's an edge connector at the back of the chassis that mates with this edge connector here. So that concludes our look at the Macintosh LC630 from 1994. So in part 2 of this video, I'll get the LC reassembled, we'll power it on, and as always, show a couple of old Macintosh games for your amusement. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for part 2.